side of the brain retains a lot of its archaic function, but is suppressed. So, in essence, there's nothing the left side of the brain can do that the right side couldn't do better. And beyond that, and ideally, you would have two halves of the brain that were fully functional. It wouldn't be specialist abilities. There'd be two sides of a phenomenally functional piece of equipment.
It's interesting. I'm just thinking there's a clip on YouTube which I've had recommended from several sources over the past few months, and it's a woman who had I forget her profession, but she certainly worked with the brain somehow, and she had a stroke, and the stroke was affecting the left-hand side of her brain, and she was watching the whole thing from the right-hand side of the brain, and she saw very clearly what happened, but without any fear. It was just like a commentary on what was happening, and she was actually perfectly okay.
I'm guessing that would be Jill Bolt Taylor.
Could have well have been, yes.
She was, I don't know if she still is, a neuroanatomist. She
That's
sort of
right,
studied the brain.
Yeah.
I've had a little bit of correspondence with her because I'm obviously fascinated by her experience, and there are a few parallels with my own early experience. Her perspective, at least the last exchange we had, was not atypical of people who are interested in left-right brain thinking, in that, yes, we need them both, and yes, I could see all this going on, but I couldn't, I think she used the example, she couldn't figure out how to dial the numbers to get this kind of thing, the emergency services and so on. And I totally understand that. I'm sure that was her experience. However, I think I mentioned before that I'm proposing the left side of the brain is not a functional, it's a sort of dysfunctional version of the right. The other piece of the jigsaw, and quite a big piece of the jigsaw, and this goes back to the evolutionary biochemistry, through development, through the construction materials, the sort of molecular engineering of how it's designed and built, is very high specification, and we don't have that anymore. So even if you're lucky enough to remove the influence of the left side of the brain or reduce it, what you're accessing is still a very dormant, even subconscious right brain. And on the one hand, that's phenomenal. On the other hand, it's not fully engaged. It's a bit like taxiing up and down the runway in Concorde or something. I mean, amazing piece of kit, but you need to get it off the ground, and that rarely happens, I think.
We were talking before we started recording. It's your parallel was, which I do understand, was a bit like you bought this supercar and a new Ferrari or something, and you kind of recommend certain fuel and oil and looking after it. You put the wrong fuel in and you don't replace the oil, and you don't basically take care of the car, so it's going to break down. And that's the way you feel, isn't it? We've got a fantastic, incredible equipment here.
Amazing.
It's so complex, and yet we don't give it the raw ingredients. Sorry for the pun here, the raw, but we don't give it the ingredients that actually it needs. We just give it anything we fancy. We go with our palate as opposed to what scientifically we should be feeding our brain.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a I wouldn't say paradox, there's sort of a circular argument within that, in that our palate, if our left brain's dominant, it's influencing everything, including our palate, so it's almost guiding its own dysfunction. The things that it might be attracted to aren't necessarily going to be what it needs to work. Its ability to see what's good for itself is almost gone, I would say. So yes, I totally agree with that. I go one step further and say we don't provide the biochemical environment in which it develops, let alone what we build it from. And I mean, I'm sort of throwing quite a few things in here, but one of the key features I'm interested in with diet isn't just the build quality, however important that is. It's partly the hormonal influence that was key in our ancestral diet. The chemicals in our plant-based diet, the sort of pigments in fruit that give fruit the coloration, they have very powerful hormonal effects. In fact, they're studied in modern science, and they're called endocrine disruptors. In other words, they will interfere with the operation of our own hormones, and that's seen as well. Is that potentially dangerous? Yet they were present 24/7 and still are in the sort of ecology of the great ape diet. and they have the ability to change the way the DNA is read. That's what hormones do. If these things were present for tens of millions of years, and suddenly they were gone, you end up, it's a bit like we have the blueprint to build this amazing flying machine, shall we say, and then we sack the craftsmen and we bring in some fly-by-night builders who buy cheap stuff from a DIY shop instead of a specialist supplier, and they can't even read the plans. So it's more than just the building materials that have gone astray.
So your feeling is that if we as a human race essentially changed our diet and respected what our brain needed in terms of raw materials, we would still maintain our, because we have brilliance a lot of the time. We have, what we've done and what we've managed to do with our resources is brilliant, what we've invented. On the other hand, as you were saying right at the beginning, we have this brilliance and we use it in the most stupid way at times. We build these war machines and then we use them against each other. We could use that technology in a very positive way. So what you're feeling is if we change the diet, we'd still have our brilliance, which the apes didn't have. They were very simple animals. We'd maintain that, but at the same time we would have the intelligence of a wider picture and see that we are all interconnected, that we do need to observe that the resources of the earth are finite and live in a much more sensible way. Am I summarising this correctly?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, we touched on the sort of left-right brain, and one of the things that comes up time and time again with the right brain's influence on our consciousness, on our perception, is empathy and a sense of connectedness. And bearing in mind, I'm saying that's the last vestige of the overall function, that both sides of the brain would have exhibited these properties. And yes, I mean, I'm probably more interested in the psychology and perception. That's really where we're in serious trouble. The brilliance that you allude to, and I agree with, I think would be even more profound. However, quite what we'd use it for and how we'd apply it would be radically different. Just because we can make phenomenally clever computer chips and make video games, I mean, yes, there's technical brilliance in there. Whether that would be something we'd actually want to do, let alone design stealth bombers or whatever, there's a massive conflict there, I think.
And you also talk, again, you've just alluded to it, that the hormonal, what you see as an imbalance, and you mentioned in the book that basically, correct me if I'm wrong here, but what I remember is that basically children are maturing too early because the diet is too testosterone dominated. Is that correct?
Going back to the sort of the evolutionary picture, and I mean, part of what I'm interested is really unifying these ideas and saying that the standard theory of evolution, the evidence there correlates quite well with the traditions of consciousness. You have to change the context a little bit. And if our evolution was, and our consciousness system was sculpted, and part of the design was based on the plant hormones, very powerful, and unless we take that into account, we're never going to have a fully developed consciousness system. And I think it would be impossible to make such a claim if there weren't a lot of evidence that our hormonal system had gone to hell, basically. If there were developmental issues, if we were susceptible to estrogen-dependent cancer, if ASD, autistic spectrum disorders, which are related to hormone imbalance, weren't very widespread, if Alzheimer's wasn't getting earlier and earlier, if our period of juvenility wasn't reducing, where that's the window of brain development, that's shrinking. There's, everywhere you look, there's evidence that our hormone system is regressing. It's becoming more primitive, and that affects how a brain can develop at a cellular level as well as the developmental windows. So it's really trying to understand the concept that it isn't just the blueprint, it's how the blueprint is read, and that's where the hormones come in. And we've lost a massive chunk of that in the blink of an eye, really. And there's no way something as complex as a human brain can possibly develop to its full function if those hormones were part of the developmental process. It would be taking away the silicon out of the silicon chip and then wondering why it doesn't work.
I know you also talk in the book about when man left the forests and moved, so he left this traditional diet that you're talking about of the fruit. And what else was man eating primarily in the forest? The fruit?
I think humans in particular had moved more towards fruit specialism than some of the other primates. So yes, high percentage of fruit, but other typical primate foods as well, leaves and nuts and seeds as an incidental part of the fruit diet.
And they moved and started to cultivate food, and they certainly started to rear animals and obviously start to eat meat. I think you said that at that point the human brain size stopped growing.
Well, that's one of the things that I'm particularly fascinated in. There's a lot of interest in academic circles as to why we're so intelligent, and it correlates. We have this enormously big fuel-hungry brain, and it seemed to be expanding on an accelerating curve, which is unusual in biology. However, equally interesting to me is why that suddenly stopped. Why you'd have this acceleration, then a sudden stall and a slight shrinkage. And the window for that seems to be approximately 200,000 years ago. And again, that's what I'm interested in. Is that to do with the loss of these hormones that were fueling the whole thing, and leaving the forest, not necessarily voluntarily? I mean, if we were dependent in a co-evolutionary sense on the forest chemicals, and it could be climate change, for example, where the forest disappears, you're suddenly in trouble if your brain development and function depended on a mature forest ecosystem. If that's gone, then what do? Well, fortunately, we were intelligent enough to survive, and we'd find foods to eat, and we'd end up processing them in ways to make them palatable, but that wouldn't necessarily allow our brain to develop in the way it was.
So, Tony, we're in a situation now where, as we've alluded a few minutes ago, we have finite resources on the planet. We're using them up at an incredible speed. The world population is also growing at quite a speed, and at some point there's going to be a real crisis, because we're going to use, too many people are using up too few resources, and it seems that unless we're able to realise this and do something about it on a practical level, we're in big trouble as a human race.
Yeah.
So are you saying that we have to change our diet quick so we actually start to understand this? What are you saying on a practical basis?
I take a step back from that to begin with, and quite simplistically say it surely, bearing in mind, I mean, you say there will be a crisis. I think there's already an ongoing crisis in many areas on an industrial scale, from probably the First World War onwards, or maybe you can go further back than that. But yes, to where the resources we have at our disposal they're diminishing rapidly and so on, and we seem to be unable to do anything about it. It must be worth considering the possibility that underpinning all that is a glitch in the equipment that makes the decisions, makes the politics, defines what is appropriate behaviour, i.e. the brain and our consciousness. If we can rule that out, then we've got some behavioural problems. If it's something that works at a structural level, and there's very good evidence that if you change the structure and the biochemistry of the brain, our behaviour alters massively and radically. Well, if that's changed in an evolutionary time frame quite recently, and there's grounds for the scope to correct that surely is the first place to look, because everything else that will come out of that, if there's a problem, we'll never figure it out. It would be expecting somebody who's congenitally blind to be able to see, and you can read it, you can sort of try as many approaches as you like with the symptoms. If you don't find the cause, it isn't going to work.
So we have to do something, don't we?
Well, yeah, I think, as I say, maybe I wasn't too clear, coming to a consensus that there might be a problem with the machine driving it all. I'm using, again, quite crude engineering sort of terms. If there's evidence for that, and I think there is. That's what Left in the Dark's about. It's really providing the evidence that there's a glitch in the consciousness equipment, the lens of perception, how we see ourselves. Then following on from that, if we can make an accurate diagnosis, we've got the possibility of treating it, correcting it, and more importantly, preventing it. And I suspect then a lot of the symptoms which we tend to think are practical, well, if we just did this or we just did that, well, people have tried to change behaviour, then they run into the psychology of the people who make the decisions for us. I think a lot of that would start to dissipate. We'd end up with common sense rather than blatant insanity, really, which is what we seem to be suffering from almost on a species-wide level. I mean, I can't see it as I can't describe it as anything else, to be quite honest.
It's quite strong words, blatant insanity.
Well, it is, but I think we're known to have killed more than 100 million of our own kind in the last century, and we're already doing quite well this century in eliminating our own kind and setting up systems so unsustainable that if they crash, the kinds of problems that we've seen in the past where there were food shortages and 10,000 people died, it will be a living nightmare, really. And we can already see that. There are plenty of people who can see the symptoms. That's why we're having this discussion. You can see the symptoms. So I don't think it's a huge leap to say that there's something seriously wrong if we can see there's a problem and we're not willing to address it.
I think one of the things that is difficult, and again we were discussing this before we went on air, is people. A lot of people increasingly are seeing there's a problem, but they don't see a practical solution. It's so that the solution appears to be so divorced from their lifestyle where they are.
Yeah.
They can't see a way through it. And also the information, we're told what we shouldn't do. We're told, well, we should fly less. We should drive the car less. We should use less power at home. We're told there's too many people. There's told we're running out of oil. We're told all these things. But no one really is providing leadership and direction with what we can do without completely and utterly changing our lives. And maybe we have to do that. I don't know. But there's no one coming forward and really being brave and say, look, I feel actually I might have a solution here, or I might have the beginning of a solution. Let's try and look at this. It's like, as I say, we're given there's all these knots that we shouldn't do, and we've got to reduce CO2 emission 10% in the next 3 years and 40% by the year 2050. But we don't even know if that's good enough. So it seems to me that what you're doing here is you're giving us another window into this to look at this. But what we need is actually someone brave enough to stand up and say the truth, that we can't go on as we are. And then there has to be people that are willing to say, yes, you're right, and to some extent follow the example. Yes,
I mean, that would be great if that were to happen. I'd still come back and I guess my interest in all of this is it possible to identify yet a deeper layer